They say that on the coldest night of 1847, 40 of London's finest families watched a duke destroy his wife with a single sentence. They say the Duchess did not cry, she did not scream, she did not beg. She simply rose from her chair, walked the length of that glittering table, and placed one yellowed envelope beside her husband's wine glass. Then she curtsied and walked out of his life. By morning, all of London was asking the same question the Duke asked himself, alone in his study, staring at that envelope with shaking hands. What was in the letter? And why, dear listener, why did the Duchess look almost relieved? This is the story of Charlotte, Duchess of Ravenscroft, and it begins at a dinner party she was never meant to survive. The chandeliers at Ravenscroft House had never burned brighter. 40 guests sat along the great mahogany table, earls and countesses, a bishop, 2 members of Parliament, and the sharpest gossips in all of London. The silver gleamed, the champagne flowed, and at the head of the table sat Edmund, the 9th Duke of Ravenscroft, smiling like a man who was about to win something. At the far end of the table sat his wife. Charlotte wore dove-gray silk that night. She had chosen it herself, though she could not have said why. Perhaps some part of her already knew that gray was the color of endings. For 8 years she had sat at the end of this table. For 8 years she had smiled at her husband's guests, remembered their children's names, and pretended not to notice the way Edmund's eyes drifted, again and again, to the woman seated at his right hand. Lavinia Crane. Lavinia, with her ruby-red gown and her tinkling laugh. Lavinia, who touched the Duke's sleeve when she spoke to him, as if the Duchess were not sitting 30 feet away, as if the Duchess were not sitting there at all. Charlotte lifted her soup spoon. She noticed with a strange calm that her hand was perfectly steady. It was between the fish course and the roast that Edmund rose to his feet. He tapped his knife against his glass, ting, 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 and the table fell silent. 40 faces turned toward him. He was a handsome man still, tall and golden-haired, and he knew it. He let the silence stretch, the way he always did. Edmund loved an audience. "My friends," he began, his voice warm as brandy, "thank you for joining me tonight. You have been loyal companions to this house, and loyalty," he smiled, "deserves honesty." Charlotte set down her spoon. Later, she would remember that small sound, silver against porcelain, as the last sound of her old life. "For 8 years," the Duke continued, "I have carried a private sorrow, a sorrow no man speaks of, though it hollows him out year after year. Ravenscroft has stood for 300 years. 9 dukes have carried this name. And I," he paused, letting his voice break just slightly, just enough, "I will have no son to carry it after me." A murmur rolled down the table like a wave. "Not through any fault of mine," Edmund said, and now his eyes found Charlotte's cold and deliberate. "My wife, the Duchess, is barren." The word landed like a slap. Someone gasped. The bishop's wife pressed her napkin to her lips. 40 pairs of eyes swung to the end of the table, hungry, horrified, delighted to watch the Duchess of Ravenscroft shatter. Charlotte did not shatter. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, and she looked at her husband the way one looks at rain through a window. "I have consulted physicians," the Duke pressed on, louder now, feeding on the scandal. "I have prayed, I have waited, but a man in my position cannot wait forever, and so, before God and before my friends, I tell you, I have petitioned to have this marriage dissolved." He reached down and took Lavinia Crane's hand. She rose beside him, one hand resting delicately on her stomach, her chin lifted in triumph. "Miss Crane," said the Duke of Ravenscroft, "is carrying my child." The table erupted. Whispers, clattering glasses, the scrape of a chair. The bishop's wife looked as though she might faint. Two countesses leaned together, already composing the letters they would write at dawn. And through all of it, every single guest kept one eye on the Duchess. Now she will weep, they thought. Now she will scream. Now she will run from the room, and we will speak of it for 20 years. Charlotte rose from her chair. The room went quiet so quickly it was almost painful. She stood there in her dove-gray silk, small and straight, and for one long moment she looked at her husband down the length of that endless table. And then she smiled, a small, calm, curious smile, the kind of smile that made more than one guest suddenly feel cold. Charlotte reached into the folds of her gown and drew out an envelope. It was old, yellowed at the corners, worn soft, as if it had been carried close for a very long time, as if it had been waiting. She walked the length of the table, unhurried, her heels clicking softly on the marble, one step after another, past the earls and the countesses and the bishop, past Lavinia Crane, whose triumphant smile was beginning to falter. Charlotte stopped beside her husband. He towered over her. She had to look up to meet his eyes, and when she did, Edmund, who had planned this evening for weeks, who had rehearsed every word, felt something twist in his chest. She did not look destroyed. She looked sorry for him. Charlotte placed the envelope gently on his plate, between the silver fork and the untouched bread. "Your mother asked me to give you this," she said. Her voice was quiet, but in that silent room every soul heard it. "She told me to wait until the day you tried to destroy me. I confess, Edmund, I hoped this day would never come." The Duke stared down at the envelope, and the color drained from his face. Because there, pressed into the old wax seal, was his father's crest. His father, the 8th Duke of Ravenscroft, dead these 11 years. "What?" His voice cracked. He tried again. "What is this?" Charlotte stepped back and sank into a perfect, graceful curtsy. The curtsy of a duchess, the last she would ever give him. "Good night, Your Grace," she said. "I do hope you enjoy the rest of your dinner." And she turned and walked out of Ravenscroft House, past 40 frozen guests, her head high, while behind her the most powerful man in the county stood white-faced at his own table, too afraid to open a letter. But what Charlotte knew, and what the Duke was about to learn, would set in motion a war that neither of them could stop. Because some secrets do not stay buried, even when the men who kept them do. To understand what was in that letter, dear listener, we must go back 8 years, to a spring morning when Charlotte first walked through the gates of Ravenscroft House as a bride of 20. She had not married for love. Women like Charlotte rarely did. Her father was a wealthy merchant, warehouses, ships, a fortune built on tea and honest work. But money in those days could not buy the one thing her father wanted for his only daughter, a name, and the Ravenscrofts had a name 300 years old. What they did not have was money. Oh, it was a well-kept secret. The old Duke had died 11 years before, and his son Edmund had spent what remained of the family fortune on horses, cards, and tailors. By the time Edmund met Charlotte, Ravenscroft House was mortgaged to its chimneys. The roof leaked. The servants had not been paid in months. So a bargain was struck, the way such bargains always were, her fortune for his title. Her father wept with pride at the wedding. Charlotte had been foolish enough back then to hope for more. Edmund was handsome. Edmund was charming when he wanted something. In the first year, she truly tried to love him. But once her dowry cleared the family debts, once the roof was mended and the creditors were gone, Edmund simply stopped seeing her, stopped speaking to her at breakfast, stopped noticing whether she was in a room. She became furniture, well-dressed, well-mannered, useful furniture. Here is what nobody in London knew. It was Charlotte who ran Ravenscroft, quietly, invisibly, from a small writing desk in the morning room. She reviewed the ledgers the steward brought her. She caught the errors, negotiated with the tenants, decided which fields to rest and which to plant. The estate had begun, for the first time in decades, to turn a profit. Edmund never asked how. He signed what was put in front of him, believed his own brilliance, and went back to London. Charlotte told herself it was enough, a useful life, a quiet life. Many women had less. There was only one person in that great cold house who truly saw her. The old Duchess, Edmund's mother. The Dowager lived in the East Wing, a sharp-eyed woman who missed nothing. In the beginning, Charlotte had feared her. But one evening, the old Duchess had watched Charlotte correct the steward's arithmetic without even looking up from her tea, and something in the old woman's face had changed. "You," the Dowager had said slowly, "are wasted on my son." From that day on, they took tea together every Thursday. It was the old Duchess who taught Charlotte which families mattered and which merely pretended to. And it was the old Duchess who, 3 years into the marriage, first said the words out loud. "There is no child, Charlotte. Do you not wonder why?" Charlotte had flushed and looked at her hands. "The fault is mine, I suppose," Edmund says. "I know what Edmund says." The old woman's voice was flat and cold. "My son has been saying it to half of London. What a burden he carries. What a barren wife he chose." She leaned forward. "Tell me, child, has he ever taken you to a physician, a real one?" "No," Charlotte admitted. "He says there is no need, he says. It is obvious." The Dowager was silent for a long time. Then she said something Charlotte would not understand for 5 more years. "When the time comes, you will learn that the truth of this house is written down and kept safe. My husband was a careless father, God rest him, but he was a very careful man." Then came the 4th winter, and with it, Lavinia Crane. She arrived as the widowed cousin of a neighbor, young, penniless, and beautiful in a way that made men stupid. Within a month she was a fixture at Edmund's dinner parties. Within 6, the servants had stopped meeting Charlotte's eyes. Charlotte knew, of course she knew, wives always know. And then in the 8th year, 2 things happened almost at once. First, whispers reached the house that Miss Crane was expecting a child, and that the Duke had begun meeting with his lawyer, Mr. Grimsby, behind closed doors. Second, the old Duchess began to die. It was her heart. The doctors gave her weeks. Charlotte sat with her every day, reading aloud, holding her thin, cold hand, while Edmund visited exactly twice, both times to ask about her will. On her last night, the old Duchess sent everyone away, everyone but Charlotte. "Close the door," she whispered, "and open the bottom drawer of my writing desk. There is a false back behind it." Charlotte's fingers found it in the dark, an envelope, yellowed with age, sealed with wax. Pressed into the seal was the crest of the 8th Duke of Ravenscroft, her husband's dead father. "My husband wrote what is in there, and I have guarded it for 11 years, the old woman said. "I prayed I would never need it. I prayed my son would grow into a better man." She smiled terribly. God, it seems, was otherwise engaged. "What is it?" Charlotte whispered. "It is the truth." The Dowager's grip tightened with the last of her strength. "Listen to me, girl. Do not open it out of curiosity. Do not open it in anger. Keep it on your person always. Trust no drawer and no servant. And the day my son tries to destroy you, and he will, Charlotte, it is coming. I have seen it in him. On that day you give it to him. In front of witnesses, if you can." "Why in front of witnesses?" The old woman's eyes glittered in the candlelight. "Because my son is only afraid of one thing in this world, an audience." She died 2 days later. Edmund wore black for a month and spent the funeral discussing horses with Lord Ashworth. And Charlotte carried the letter. Through that whole long winter, sewn into the lining of her gowns, she carried it to dinners, to church, to bed, waiting, hoping the old woman was wrong. Until the night 40 guests came to dinner, and her husband rose, and tapped his knife against his glass. Ting, ting, ting. Now, dear listener, you know how the letter came to be on that plate. But you do not yet know what was written inside it. Edmund was about to find out, alone at midnight in his dead father's study. And what he read there would not break his heart. It would do something far more dangerous. The last carriage rolled away from Ravenscroft House a little after midnight. The dinner had collapsed, of course. After the Duchess walked out, the guests had picked at their food in dreadful silence, made their excuses, and fled hungry not for roast beef, but for their writing desks. By morning, the story would be in 40 drawing rooms. By Sunday, in 400. Edmund sat alone in his father's study, and the envelope sat on the desk in front of him. He had carried it there himself, pinched between two fingers like something dead. Lavinia had wanted to see it. He had shut the door in her face. Now he sat, with a bottle of brandy at his elbow, staring at his father's seal. 11 years that man had been in the ground. Edmund could still hear his voice, cold, dry, permanently disappointed. Stand straight, boy. Stop preening, boy. God gave you a mirror instead of a spine. Edmund drank and broke the seal. Inside were 2 documents. The first was in his father's hand, that cramped, precise writing he knew from 100 lectures. The second was older, printed on a physician's letterhead. Dr. Nathaniel Hale, physician, Harley Street. He read his father's letter first. My son asterisk. If you are reading this, then your mother is dead, and you have done something despicable. Those are the only 2 conditions under which she was permitted to release it. I know you, Edmund. I have always known you, though it gave me no pleasure. You will remember the fever you suffered at 15, the summer at Ravenscroft. You nearly died. You will remember that afterward Dr. Hale examined you at my request several times over 2 years. You complained bitterly about it. You were never told why. I will tell you now plainly, as the physician told me. The fever left its mark on you, Edmund. You will never father a child, not with a wife, not with anyone. Dr. Hale was certain, and I paid 2 further men of medicine in Edinburgh to be certain of his certainty. Their conclusions were identical. His report is enclosed. I did not tell you because I knew what you would do with such knowledge. You would drown it in self-pity and brandy and blame the world. Instead, I made arrangements. The title will pass to your cousin's line, as it must. This cannot be helped, and it is no sin of yours. A man cannot be blamed for a fever. But hear me, Edmund, from whatever place God has seen fit to put me. A man can be blamed for what he does with the truth. If there is ever a child presented as yours, you will know it is a lie. And if you ever stand before the world and lay the blame for an empty nursery upon your wife, upon any woman knowing what you now know, then you are not my son, and Ravenscroft was built by better men than you. Do the decent thing for once. Your father. Edmund read it twice. Then he unfolded the physician's report, and there it was, in dry medical Latin and plain English both. Dated, signed, witnessed. No issue possible, condition permanent. He sat very still for a long time. And here, dear listener, is where a better man's story would have turned. A better man would have wept. A better man would have thought of the woman he had just destroyed in front of 40 witnesses, the wife he had called Barren, whose only fault was marrying him. A better man would have thought of Lavinia's hand resting on her stomach and asked himself the obvious, terrible question, if not mine, then whose? Edmund thought of none of these things. Edmund thought, who else knows? That was the whole of it, not guilt, not grief, only the cold arithmetic of a cornered animal. Because if this letter was true, and he knew in his bones that it was, he remembered the fever, he remembered old Hale's grave face and the endless examinations, then everything he had said at dinner was a lie. The annulment was built on a lie. Lavinia's child was. His mind slammed that door shut and locked it. If this got out, he would not merely be embarrassed. He would be finished. A man who publicly branded his innocent wife Barren to cover his own defect, while parading another man's bastard as his heir. Society forgave many sins. It did not forgive being made ridiculous. His eyes went to the fireplace. The coals were still glowing. Edmund stood, swaying only slightly, and crossed the room with the letter and the report in his hand. For one single moment, he hesitated. His father's handwriting seemed to stare up at him. Do the decent thing, for once. "You never did like me, old man," Edmund said quietly. And he dropped both pages onto the coals. The paper browned, curled, and caught. 11 years of truth burned down to ash in less than a minute, and Edmund watched it burn with his glass in his hand, and felt, he told himself, nothing at all. Then he sat back down at his father's desk, took out a clean sheet of paper, and began to think. Really think, in that low, cunning way that had carried him through a lifetime of card tables. The letter was destroyed. Old Dr. Hale was dead. He'd seen the notice months ago. His father was dead. His mother was dead. The Edinburgh physicians, whoever they were nameless and 40 years gone. That left exactly one person alive, who knew what the letter had said. Charlotte. Charlotte, who had read it, she must have read it, why else that pitying smile? Charlotte, who had carried it for a winter, waiting. Charlotte, who could stand up in a courtroom, or worse, in a drawing room, and tell the world what the 8th Duke had written about his son. Ah, but who would believe her? Edmund's pen began to move. She had no proof anymore. Only her word, the word of a bitter, discarded wife, a merchant's daughter against a duke of the realm. And a woman's word could be made worthless. It was done every day. A whisper here, a doctor's opinion there. Have you noticed the Duchess seems unwell, talking of secret letters, of conspiracies? Her mother's family, you know, there were always rumors. So sad, so very sad. By the time he was finished with her, Charlotte could stand on the steps of St. Paul's and shout the truth to all of London, and they would only shake their heads and pity the poor mad creature. Edmund drained his glass and smiled for the first time that night. Tomorrow he would send for Grimsby. Grimsby knew how these things were arranged: papers, physicians, the quiet men who ran quiet asylums. The annulment would proceed. The child would be born a Ravenscroft, and the 9th Duke would survive as he had always survived, because he was willing to do what better men were not. There was only one small detail the Duke of Ravenscroft did not know, as he climbed the stairs to bed that night, well pleased with himself. His mother had told Charlotte to keep the letter on her person always. And Charlotte, who had spent 8 years catching the errors in other people's ledgers, was a careful woman, far too careful to carry the only copy of anything. The original had burned in the study fire. But, dear listener, it was not the only paper in England with old Dr. Hale's signature on it. And far away, on a ship somewhere between Calcutta and London, a young man with his father's grave gray eyes was coming home, with a sea chest full of his father's journals. The Duke had burned the truth. He did not yet understand that the truth, like the Ravenscrofts themselves, had heirs. They gave Charlotte 3 days to leave the house she had saved. It was Grimsby who delivered the message. Mr. Josiah Grimsby, the Duke's lawyer, a narrow man with damp hands and a smile like a paper cut. He arrived at breakfast, laid a document beside her teacup, and informed her that His Grace, out of generosity, was granting her use of the dower house at the edge of the estate, until the annulment was final. The dower house, Charlotte repeated. His Grace is under no obligation to provide anything at all, said Grimsby, given the circumstances of the marriage. He let his eyes rest on her, small and satisfied. You may take your personal effects. Your maid will assist you. The Duke asks that the Ravenscroft jewels remain naturally. They belong to the estate. The estate. Charlotte almost laughed. She had remortgaged and unmortgaged that estate with her own pen. She knew what every acre of it earned and what every chimney of it cost, and this damp little man was telling her about the estate. Naturally, she said, and poured herself more tea, because she would not give him trembling hands to report back to his master. The dower house sat a mile from the great house, behind a screen of black elms, a squat stone widow's box, shut up for 11 years, smelling of mice and cold ash. The chimneys smoked. The roof wept in the corners. Charlotte stood in the doorway with 2 trunks and her maid, and heard, very distantly across the park, the sound of wagons. Furniture was already being delivered to Ravenscroft House. New furniture. Lavinia Crane was redecorating. Within a fortnight, Lavinia had taken Charlotte's morning room, the one with the little writing desk, and turned it into her boudoir. She wore the pearl earrings Edmund had given Charlotte on her wedding day, wore them to church, where all the county could see. The message could not have been clearer if she had printed it in the Times. And society did what society does, dear listener. The invitations stopped, all of them within the month. Women who had taken Charlotte's tea for 8 years now crossed the street in the village. Lady Ashworth, who owed her son's gambling debts to Charlotte's discreet generosity, looked straight through her at the milliners, as though she were a window pane. Because Edmund had been busy. Oh, he had been very busy. The whispers ran ahead of her everywhere she went. Have you heard? The Duchess, well, we can hardly call her that now, was always strange, you know. The Duke bore it in silence for years, poor man, and now she's telling the wildest tales, secret letters, if you please, from the old Duke, dead these 11 years. Letters no living soul has ever seen. Her maid says she talks to herself. So sad, so very sad. The trap was elegant, Charlotte had to admit. She had said nothing to anyone about the letter, which meant Edmund was spreading her accusation for her, twisted into the ravings of a madwoman before she ever had the chance to make it. If she stayed silent, the lie stood unopposed. If she spoke, she confirmed the story. There she goes, poor creature, on about her letters again. Her father might have fought for her once, but her father was 4 years in his grave, and her fortune, every shilling of it, had been swallowed whole by her marriage settlement, signed over in trust to her husband, as the law of the day demanded. She had come to Ravenscroft rich. She would leave it with nothing. Only one soul from the great house came to her. On the 3rd evening, as the light died, there was a knock, and there on the step stood Mrs. Pettigrew, the housekeeper, 60 years old, iron-gray, and carrying a basket of bread, ham, and beeswax candles like contraband. Mrs. Pettigrew, you shouldn't be here, if he learns of it. I've run that house since his grace was in short trousers, madam, and a nastier little boy I never met. The old woman set down the basket and looked Charlotte in the eye. 31 years I served the old Duchess. I know who she took her tea with of a Thursday, and I know who's kept us all in wages these 8 years, whatever name was signed at the bottom. She sniffed. I'll come Tuesdays and Fridays. Let them dismiss me. I should like to see them run that house without me. It was the first kindness in a fortnight, and it nearly broke Charlotte where all of Edmund's cruelty had not. But she did not weep. She sat Mrs. Pettigrew down and poured her tea and began, carefully, to plan. Because Charlotte had one card left, and it was time to play it. The night before that terrible dinner, guided by an instinct she could not name, or perhaps by the old Duchess's voice in her memory, trust no drawer and no servant, Charlotte had sat up till dawn and copied the letter. Every line of her father-in-law's letter, every word of Dr. Hale's report, in her own careful hand. The copy was sewn into her gray traveling cloak. The original had gone onto Edmund's plate. A copy, she knew, proved nothing on its own. Any bitter wife could write out a fantasy and call it a dead man's words. But the copy was a map, names, dates, places. Dr. Nathaniel Hale, physician, Harley Street. The man who had examined Edmund with his own hands. The man whose testimony no one could dismiss. If Dr. Hale would stand before the court and say what he knew, it would all be over. One respectable witness. That was all she needed. One. "Mrs. Pettigrew," she said, "I need to get a letter to London, not through the village post." The village postmaster, she did not need to add, reported to the great house. Mrs. Pettigrew's nephew drove a brewer's wagon to London every week. The letter went out on Friday, hidden in a crate of empty bottles, addressed to Harley Street. Then Charlotte waited. 10 days. 12. She wore a path in the cold little parlor, telling herself it was the winter roads, the doctor's crowded practice, anything. On the 15th day, the answer came. It was not from Dr. Hale. It was from a solicitor's office, brief and correct and utterly indifferent, and Charlotte had to read it 3 times before her mind would take it in. "Madam, we regret to inform you that Dr. Nathaniel Hale departed this life on the 14th of October last, after a short illness. As executors of his estate, we must further advise that the contents of his consulting rooms, including all papers and records of his practice, were purchased entire, shortly after his decease, by a private party, and are no longer in our keeping. We remain, etc." Charlotte stood very still in the cold parlor, the letter shaking at last. At last her hands shook in the fading light. Dead, 3 months dead, and his records, 40 years of them, bought up whole by a private party within weeks of his passing. She did not have to wonder who. She could see Grimsby's paper-cut smile as she read. Edmund had not merely burned the letter. He had reached out and burned every road that led back to it. The doctor was dead. The records were gone. The witnesses were dust in Edinburgh. There was no one left alive in England who could stand up and swear to what the 8th Duke had known. That, at least, dear listener, is what the Duke believed. But a man who spends his whole life ignoring other people makes a particular kind of mistake. He forgets to ask the simplest questions, such as whether a dead doctor might have had a family, such as where 40 years of a careful man's real secrets are kept. For old Dr. Hale had been a very careful man, of exactly the same school as the 8th Duke of Ravenscroft. Careful men, as we shall see, tend to find one another. And 10,000 miles away, in the hold of the merchant ship Meridian, a locked sea chest rode the swells toward England, while above it, at the rail, stood a young army surgeon who had just buried his father in absentia, reading his last letter from home by lantern light. The letter ended with a line that had puzzled him all the way from Calcutta. "If ever a lady of Ravenscroft should come asking after my papers, James, give her everything and stand by her. She will be in the right, and she will be alone." The hearing opened in London on a grey Tuesday in February, and by Wednesday morning it was the only thing anyone in England wished to talk about. Ravenscroft, the newspapers called it, in letters usually reserved for wars. The public gallery filled 2 hours before the doors opened. Ladies of quality sent their footmen to hold seats. It was, one paper wrote gleefully, the finest entertainment London has enjoyed since the coronation. The entertainment, of course, was Charlotte. She came to court each day in the same grey traveling cloak, the one, though no soul in that room knew it, with a copied letter sewn into its lining, and sat alone at a scarred oak table with Mr. Beauchamp, the one solicitor in London willing to take her case. Beauchamp was 70, half-deaf and honest, which is why he was also poor. Every other lawyer she had written to had discovered, with great regret, a conflict of interest. It had not taken Charlotte long to understand what that meant. Edmund had gotten to them first. Across the aisle sat the Duke of Ravenscroft, golden and grave, wearing his best expression of wounded nobility. and beside him Grimsby. Grimsby ran the case the way a butcher runs a knife. He did not shout. That was the horror of it. He asked his little questions in his damp, patient voice, and each one left a mark that would not close. "Your Grace," he began, bowing to her title with exquisite mockery, "in 8 years of marriage you gave His Grace no child. Do you dispute this?" "I do not dispute that there was no child," Charlotte said. "I dispute the reason." "Ah yes, the reason." Grimsby turned to the gallery, inviting them in. "Your Grace has a theory, I understand, involving a letter, a most remarkable letter written by a dead man, entrusted by a dead woman, seen by no living person but yourself, and now, we are told, burned." He let the pause do its work. "Tell me, madam, is there anything in your account that a single living witness can confirm?" "The letter existed. 40 of your master's guests watched me place it in his hands." 40 guests watched you place asterisk and envelope on a plate," said Grimsby pleasantly. "For all any of them could swear, it contained a recipe for plum cake." Laughter in the gallery. The judge tapped for order without much conviction. So it went, hour after hour, day after day. Grimsby produced the physician who had attended Charlotte, a Dr. Mordecai Vane, sleek as an otter, whom Charlotte had met exactly once, when Edmund had summoned him to the house years ago to treat her winter cough. Dr. Vane now testified at length and in Latin to her Grace's nervous constitution, her melancholic tendencies, her flights of feminine imagination. Then Grimsby did something worse. He called her own former maid, the girl who had dressed her hair for 6 years, who stood in the box, twisting her gloves, not meeting Charlotte's eyes, and recited in a flat, memorized voice that her mistress talked to herself of an evening, and wrote strange letters at night, and spoke often of secret papers. They gave her money, asterisk Charlotte thought, watching the girl's miserable face, or they threatened her family. "Oh, child, I would have forgiven you either one if you had only asked." But the worst came on the 4th day. That was when Grimsby rose, smoothed his papers, and informed the court that since her Grace disputed the grounds of the petition, since she insisted the asterisk incapacity lay elsewhere, His Grace had no choice but to request that the question be settled in the customary manner. A medical examination of the Duchess by a panel of court-appointed physicians, Dr. Vane among them, to determine and to publish the intimate condition of her body before all of England. The gallery leaned forward as one animal. Charlotte sat very still. She had known this might come. Beauchamp had warned her, mumbling and ashamed. It was the oldest move on the board. The examination itself was designed to be an obliteration, a lady stripped of every dignity before strangers, her body discussed in open court like a mare at auction. Most women, faced with it, withdrew all opposition and signed whatever was put before them. That was, of course, its purpose. "Your Grace need only withdraw her objections," said Grimsby gently to her, though he faced the judge, "and spare herself this unpleasantness. His Grace has authorized me to say that a generous settlement remains open. £300 per annum and a cottage in Scotland. He bears her no ill will. He wishes only to be free." £300. Her dowry had been 90,000. Charlotte rose. The room went quiet. She looked not at Grimsby but past him at Edmund, who had the grace for 1/2 second to look away. "I refused a smaller insult at my own dinner table, sir," she said. "I see no reason to accept a larger one in a court of law. Let your physicians come." That evening the newspapers could hardly set the type fast enough. Some called her shameless. One or two, for the first time, called her brave. And in the great houses of London, over 40 dinner tables, a strange small crack appeared in the wall of certainty. She did not withdraw. The ladies murmured to each other while the gentlemen talked politics. A guilty woman would have taken the cottage. Why did she not take the cottage? The court adjourned for a week to appoint the panel. Charlotte returned to the Dower House to wait, with the taste of iron in her mouth, and for the first time, the very beginning of an idea that she might actually lose, not the case only, but everything, her name, her liberty, perhaps even her freedom. For Dr. Vane's testimony had been laying bricks, neat professional bricks, on the road to a quiet private asylum. And then, dear listener, on the third night of that terrible week, God, or the old Duchess, sent Charlotte a gift, though it did not look like one. It looked like a toothache. It was past 1 in the morning, and Charlotte, sleepless, had gone down to the cold kitchen for oil of cloves. The dower house sat dark behind its screen of elms, and from its upper landing, as she returned with her candle shielded, its one small window looked out across the park, toward the old boathouse by the frozen lake, a quarter-mile off, abandoned these 10 years. There was a light in the boathouse window. Charlotte stopped, blew out her candle, and watched. A carriage stood in the trees by the lake path, a plain, dark carriage, no arms on the door, the sort of careful man hires when he does not wish to be known. As she watched, a figure came down the path from the direction of the great house, moving quickly, a woman, hooded, holding her skirts out of the snow. The boathouse door opened before she reached it. Whoever waited inside had been watching for her. For one moment, as the door swung wide, the lamplight fell full on the woman's face. Lavinia Crane. The door closed. Charlotte stood at the black window, her breath fogging the glass, her heart going like a hammer. 20 minutes she waited. 30. Then the door opened again, and 2 figures came out into the moon-gray snow, standing close, much too close, in the shadow of the eaves. The man's back was to her, but then he turned to hand Lavinia along the icy path, a narrow man, spare and stooped, and the moonlight found the side of his face. Grimsby. And as Charlotte watched, Josiah Grimsby, the Duke's own lawyer, took Lavinia Crane's hand, took it in both of his, and pressed it bare against his lips, and held it there. It was not gallantry. Gallantry does not last the count of 10. Lavinia did not pull her hand away. She stepped nearer and touched his cheek once in the manner of a woman who has done it many times before, and then she drew her hood up and hurried back along the path toward the great house, toward the Duke's house and the Duke's bed, carrying, as all England had been told, the Duke's child. The plain carriage swallowed Grimsby and rolled away into the dark, and the boathouse light went out. Charlotte stood alone on the landing for a long, long time. She thought of Grimsby, day after day at Edmund's right hand, running Edmund's case, spending Edmund's money. This was the man tearing her to pieces in open court. She thought of Lavinia's hand resting so prettily on her stomach before 40 guests. She thought of the letter sewn into her cloak. You will never father a child, Edmund. Not with a wife. Not with anyone. Someone had fathered Lavinia Crane's child. Charlotte had assumed, all London had assumed, some nameless indiscretion, papered over by a Duke too vain to question his good fortune. But what if it was not nameless at all? What if the child's father was, at this very moment, managing the lawsuit that would make that child the 10th Duke of Ravenscroft? The plan was no longer Edmund's plan, she saw suddenly, with the cold clarity of 1 o'clock in the morning. Edmund thought he was using them. He was a puppet in his own theater, a vain, cruel, stupid puppet, and Grimsby held the strings, and Lavinia had tied them. It was monstrous, it was perfect, and she could prove exactly none of it. Who would believe her, the mad woman of the dower house, with her invisible letters, if she now announced she had seen the Duke's lawyer kissing the Duke's mistress in a boathouse at midnight? Grimsby would smile his paper-cut smile. Another vision, your grace. You do keep busy evenings. No, this card could not be played from her hand. Not alone, not yet. Charlotte went back to her cold bed and lay staring at the ceiling until dawn, and her toothache was quite forgotten, for her mind was moving now the way it moved over a broken ledger, patiently, line by line, hunting the flaw in the columns. Every conspiracy, like every false account, has one weakness. Somewhere there is a number that does not balance, a date, a witness, a paper trail. A private party purchased the doctor's records. The solicitors had written. Purchases, thought Charlotte, staring into the dark, leave receipts. And 300 miles to the south, through a channel fog, the merchant ship Meridian passed the lights of Dover in the night, carrying the mails, a cargo of indigo and one locked sea chest, and made her slow way up the Black River toward London. Dear listener, there is a moment in every long winter when it seems spring has simply been cancelled, when the cold is no longer weather but a verdict. For Charlotte, that moment came in the last week of February, and it came in 3 blows. The first blow arrived by post. She had spent the week following her one thin thread, purchases, leave receipts. She wrote again to Dr. Hale's executors, courteously requesting the name of the private party who had bought his papers. She wrote to the auction houses. She wrote to a records clerk that Beauchamp knew. The answer, when it came, was a masterpiece of nothing. The sale had been handled entire for cash by an agent, a Mr. Pole, of no fixed office, acting on behalf of an unnamed client. Mr. Pole had signed the papers, taken the crates, and vanished like breath off a mirror. There was a receipt, oh yes. It led to a man who did not exist. Grimsby's work. She could feel his damp fingerprints on every line of it. The number that did not balance had been balanced by a professional. The second blow came on a Thursday. Old Beauchamp did not appear at their appointed hour. Instead came a boy with a note in an unfamiliar hand. Her solicitor had suffered an apoplexy in the night. He lived, thank God. But the whole left side of him did not, and he would not stand before a judge again in this life. He had dictated one line for her, hardly legible, and it broke her heart worse than all of Grimsby's cruelties together. Forgive me, your grace. I fear I was never enough, and now I am nothing at all. She wrote that same day to 11 London solicitors. She received, in the days that followed, 11 letters of polite, identical regret. The wall was complete. When the court resumed on Monday, the Duchess of Ravenscroft would stand entirely alone. But it was the third blow, dear listener, that was meant to kill. It fell on the Saturday. Charlotte had walked to the village church at dawn, as she now did daily, not only for her soul's sake, but because it was the one place no one could decently refuse her entry. She was gone 1 hour. When she returned, her gray traveling cloak hung on its peg by the door, exactly where she had left it. Exactly. That was what stopped her on the threshold. She had left it, she was certain, with the left shoulder toward the wall. It hung now with the right. Her hands were steady as she took it down. 8 years of Ravenscroft had taught her hands to be steady while everything behind them fell, and she turned back the hem and found the lining along the left seam opened and resewn. Neatly, quickly, with gray thread that was very nearly but not quite the gray of her own. The copy was gone. She stood in the little cold hallway, holding the cloak, and understood everything in perfect order like a ledger at last unlocked. The new housemaid, the quiet girl from the village, the only servant the dower house budget allowed, the girl who had been so very attentive in brushing and airing her mistress's clothes, hired locally, recommended warmly, planted, of course, from the first day. Charlotte did not rage. She called the girl in and looked at her, and the girl went white to the lips and began to cry before a single question was asked, and between the sobs it all came out. The man in the plain dark carriage on the lake road, the 5 sovereigns, the promise that no harm was meant, and this was the part the girl choked on, the other thing. He knew about my brother, madam, my brother that took the squire's pheasants last year. He said one word from the great house, and Tom would be on a ship to Van Diemen's Land. He said it very kind, madam. That was the worst of it, how kind he said it. I know exactly how he said it, Charlotte said quietly. She gave the girl her wages and did not turn her out into the snow, because there had been enough of that in this story already. But now she cooked her own supper and laid her own fire, and the dower house was silent as a tomb. Understand what the theft truly meant, dear listener. It was not the paper. Charlotte carried every line of that letter in her memory. She could have rewritten it in an hour. The paper proved nothing anyway. No, the theft meant that they knew. They knew she had names, dates, the doctor's exact words. They knew what road she would try to travel, and now they would burn its bridges ahead of her, one by one, with a week's head start. And it meant one thing more, the coldest thing of all. They were inside her walls. There was no room in England, however small, where she could be certain she was alone. On Sunday evening, as the light failed, the plain, dark carriage came up the drive openly at last, and Grimsby stepped down from it, brushing snow from his sleeve, and asked with perfect courtesy if her Grace might spare him 10 minutes. He sat by her meager fire, uninvited, drawing off his gloves finger by finger, and laid a single document on the table between them. "The court resumes at 10 o'clock tomorrow," he said. "The medical panel is appointed. Dr. Vane presides. I will not distress you with the particulars of the procedure, but I have taken the liberty of asking. There will be 7 gentlemen present, and the findings will be read into the public record and printed, I should imagine, in every newspaper in the kingdom by Wednesday." He aligned the document precisely with the table's edge. "Or, Your Grace may sign this tonight. Consent to the annulment. Contest nothing. 300 per annum, the cottage at Inverness, and a swift, quiet end. His Grace is even prepared to state publicly that you were a dutiful wife. You would leave with your reputation intact. A pause fine as a razor, such as it is. And if I sign nothing and survive your panel, and stand up in that court alone, and tell them what was in the letter, and you will be describing, without witnesses or papers, a document that no living person but yourself has ever claimed to see," said Grimsby, "in contradiction of your own physician's sworn testimony as to your nervous condition, and the court will draw its conclusions, and afterward, I fear, kinder men than I will begin to discuss where a lady in so distressed a state of mind may best be cared for." He rose and took up his gloves. "Dr. Vane has a particular establishment in mind. Near Bath, very restful, I'm told. The Duke would spare no expense." At the door he paused, and for one moment the lawyer's varnish thinned, and something older and hungrier looked out from underneath. "You saw nothing at the boathouse, madam," he said softly. "Whatever you believe you saw nothing. Sign the paper. Take Scotland. Winters there are long, but they end. There are places where they do not." Then he was gone, and the carriage wheels creaked away over the snow, and the house was silent. Charlotte sat by the dying fire for a long time. Understand her, dear listener, before you judge her for what she did next. She was 30 years old. Her parents were dead. Her fortune was legally her husband's. Her lawyer lay half paralyzed in Camden Town. Her one piece of paper was ash or worse. Her single ally was a 60-year-old housekeeper who risked her livelihood with every basket of bread. Against her stood a duke, a fortune that had once been hers, a bought physician with an asylum's papers half completed, and a lawyer who had just threatened her with living burial while putting on his gloves. And tomorrow at 10 o'clock, 7 strange men were going to be permitted to lay hands on her, and all England would read about it over breakfast. The old Duchess had promised her the truth would be enough, but the old Duchess had never stood where Charlotte stood tonight, and the truth, unwitnessed, weighs exactly nothing. It does not stop carriages. It does not open asylum doors from the inside. Charlotte drew the candle nearer. She read the document through twice in Grimsby's beautiful, merciless clerk hand. Freely consents, contests nothing. £300 per annum, residence at Inverness. Somewhere across the Black Park, the great house blazed with light. Lavinia was giving a supper party. Charlotte took up the pen. Her hands, her famous, steady hands, did not shake at all, And somehow that was the most terrible thing of all, that a woman's whole life could end so quietly, in a cold parlor, in perfect penmanship. She dipped the pen. And at that moment, dear listener, at that exact moment, there came a knocking at the door of the Dower house. Not Grimsby's civil tap, not Mrs. Pettigrew's homely rattle. A stranger's knock, young, hard, urgent, a fist used to being answered, and a voice through the wind that Charlotte had never heard in her life, calling a name she had never told a living soul in that county. Your Grace, my name is Hale, James Hale. I believe you wrote a letter to my father. For the space of 3 heartbeats, Charlotte did not move. The pen hung over the paper. The wind worried the shutters, and through the door came the voice again, rough with cold and travel. Your Grace, please. My name is James Hale. Dr. Nathaniel Hale was my father. I've ridden from London since noon. I beg you, open the door. It is a trick, said the part of her mind that had survived Grimsby. He has heard the name Hale from the stolen copy. He has sent some hireling to play the son, to see what more you know, or to lure you out into the dark. That is how it would be done. That is exactly how it would be done. Charlotte set down the pen. She went to the door, but she did not open it. If you are Dr. Hale's son, she said through the oak, then you will know what your father wrote at the end of his last letter to you, the letter that reached you at sea. Silence. The wind. Then the voice came back, slower and changed, as if the man on the other side of the door had just understood exactly what kind of house he was standing in front of, and what had been done to the woman inside it. He wrote, if ever a lady of Ravenscroft should come asking after my papers, James, give her everything and stand by her. She will be in the right, and she will be alone. A pause. I did not understand it, madam. I have carried that letter 10,000 miles, and I did not understand one word of it. And then I landed on Thursday and went to my father's executors on Friday, and they gave me a letter from a lady of Ravenscroft, asking after my father's papers. His voice dropped. I understand it now. Charlotte opened the door. He stood bareheaded in the blowing snow, a tall young man of perhaps 18-20, burned brown by an Indian sun that had no business in an English February, in a traveling coat white to the shoulders. He had ridden hard, the horse behind him was done, and his eyes, grave, gray, level, were the eyes of the report she had copied line by line at midnight. His father's eyes. You had better come in, Dr. Hale, said Charlotte. You find me. She glanced back at Grimsby's beautiful document lying on the table at a convenient moment. He would not sit until she sat. He refused brandy and took tea, which told her something. His hands around the cup were a surgeon's hands, scrubbed and steady, and there were new lines in his young face. Charlotte would learn, much later, that he had come home with those lines, from places on the northern frontier that he never spoke of at dinner. He set his saddlebag on the table between them, and spoke like a man who had rehearsed all the way from London, and now found the speech useless. Madam, I'll be plain. My father died in October. I was told it was a short illness, and I have no reason to doubt it. He was 74. But by the time word reached me and I got home, his rooms were stripped. 40 years of practice, casebooks, letters, every record sold entire, weeks after his death, to a buyer nobody can name. His jaw set. My father kept the confidences of half the great families of England, and some man bought all their secrets for cash before his son could cross the ocean. I came home angry, madam. Then I read your letter at the executors, and I made some inquiries in town about Ravenscroft, and now I am rather more than angry. Then you know what is said of me. I know what 40 dinner guests and 3 newspapers say. He looked at her steadily. And I know what my father said. She will be in the right. My father was never wrong about anything in his life, madam. It was his single most irritating quality. And Charlotte, for the first time since the night of the dinner, laughed. It came out cracked and strange, half a sob, and she pressed her hand to her mouth, appalled at herself. James Hale politely examined the fire until she had finished. Then he unbuckled the saddlebag. "They stole his practice records," he said, "but my father was of the old school, madam. The consulting room papers were what he called the asterisk shop window." He drew out a thick quarto volume bound in scuffed calf, and then another, and laid them on the table like a man laying down aces. "These are his private journals. 41 volumes, 1806 to this past October. They never left our house. They came to me under his will, sealed in a sea chest with his instruments, and no auction agent ever laid eyes on them." Charlotte looked at the books and hardly dared touch them. "The summer of 1824, she said quietly. "A boy of 15, a fever at Ravenscroft. Volume 19. He had it flagged already with a strip of surgeon's plaster. He opened it and turned it toward her, and there it was, the small, upright, unhurried hand of a careful man, day by day, and Charlotte read, and her eyes filled, and she read on. It was all there. The fever, the crisis, the long fear. And then across the 2 years that followed, entry after entry, the examinations, the consultations, the reluctant conclusion spelled out in the plain private words the doctor allowed no one else to see, told the Duke today. He took it as he takes everything, like stone. Asked me twice, was I certain? I said a man may be certain of very little in medicine, but of this I was certain. Edinburgh concurs, both men independently. The boy is not to be told. His Grace fears what the knowledge would make of him. I fear rather what ignorance will make of him, and said so. We were, for the first time in 30 years, at odds. And further on, in an entry dated years later, this, and here Charlotte stopped breathing. The Duke came to Harleysont today, which he has never done, failing and knows it. He asked me a strange service, to make a fair copy of the 1826 report, notarized, witnessed. He has drafted besides a letter to the boy in his own hand, and some instrument for his bankers that he did not show me, in case Edmund one day does the thing we both fear. Hale, you know the thing I mean. I knew it. God help the woman, whoever she proves to be. The notarized copy I have lodged under seal with the Royal College of Physicians, per his instruction and mine, Hale and Ravenscroft, joint deposit, to be opened on lawful petition. 2 old men planting a tree we shall never sit under. Well, that is what old men are for. The room was very quiet. The Royal College, Charlotte whispered. It has been there all this time 4 miles from that courtroom. Under joint seal, said James Hale. Lodged by 2 dead men against this exact day. My father's journals give the deposit number. He leaned forward. And you'll have marked the other thing, madam. Some instrument for his bankers. The old Duke drafted something more than the medical copy, something my father never saw. If it still exists, it sits in a bank vault in London, and I would give a great deal to know what a man of that stamp thought a fitting answer to a son of that stamp. Coutts, said Charlotte slowly. The Ravenscrofts have banked at Coutts for 100 years. Edmund has never mentioned, but then Edmund has never read a paper through in his life. He signs the last page. She looked up. Dr. Hale, the court sits at 10 tomorrow morning. At 10 tomorrow morning, 7 physicians appointed by my husband's lawyer are to examine me for the entertainment of the newspapers, and by the week's end I am promised either Scotland or an asylum near Bath. I have no counsel, my solicitor lies paralyzed in Camden Town, and no other man in London will take my brief. It is past 10 o'clock at night. It is 90 miles to London. She spread her hands, and the terrible arithmetic lay on the table between them next to Grimsby's document. You have brought me the whole truth 11 hours too late to use it. James Hale looked at her for a moment. Then he stood and buttoned his coat. My father had a pupil, he said. Half his students feared him and the other half loved him, but only one of them read for the bar afterward instead. Said medicine showed him the wounds and law showed him the knives. He is a king's counsel now. He is also my godfather, and he dined at our table every Sunday for 20 years, And if I stand on his doorstep in Lincoln's Inn at 5 o'clock in the morning and tell him that the men who bought my father's papers are the same men who mean to put my father's asterisk patient's wife under examination by 7 hired physicians at 10. For the first time, the young surgeon smiled, and it was not entirely a gentle smile. Then, madam, I believe we shall discover why they call it asterisk breaking one's fast. 90 miles, said Charlotte, in one night in this. I have ridden further in worse, madam, with less reason. He hesitated, and the sunburnt formality cracked, and underneath it was something younger and very earnest. My father asked one thing of me in his last letter, your grace, one thing in his whole life, stand by her. I do not intend to explain to him at some later date that I was slow about it. And so it was, dear listener, that at 11 o'clock on that bitter Sunday night, Mrs. Pettigrew's nephew's brewer's wagon creaked out of the Dower House lane with its lanterns dark, past the plain carriage that watched the main gates, by the old lake road that only the servants and the Duchess knew, carrying south toward the London turnpike. One exhausted saddle horse tied behind, one sea chest of 41 calf-bound volumes, one young surgeon riding guard over it like the crown jewels, and one woman in a gray cloak with an unsigned surrender in her pocket, watching the black shape of Ravenscroft House slide past the elms for what she swore would not, whatever came of this, be the last time. Behind them in the great house the supper party glittered on. Lavinia wore the pearls. Edmund proposed the toasts. Grimsby in the corner checked his watch and was content. At 10 tomorrow it would all be over. He was, as it happens, quite right about that. At 10 o'clock on Monday morning, the courtroom was so full that 2 baronets were sharing a chair. Word of the examination had raced through London over the weekend, and society had turned out as if for a hanging which, dear listener, in every way that mattered, is exactly what it expected to see. In the front row of the gallery sat Lavinia Crane, in violet silk and Charlotte's pearls, glowing like a woman 1 week from a coronation. Beside the petitioner's table stood Dr. Vane and his 6 colleagues, all in black, like crows on a fence. Edmund lounged golden and grave. Grimsby aligned his papers with the table's edge and checked his watch. At 1 minute past 10, the judge asked whether the respondent was present and whether she was represented. And a voice from the back of the courtroom said, "She is, my lord, on both counts." Now you must understand what the name Sir Henry Marchmont meant in a London courtroom in that year. Marchmont, King's Counsel, had not lost a case in 11 years. He was 60, built like a church door and famous for 2 things. He charged fees that made railway barons weep, and he chose his cases the way other men choose their wives, rarely, carefully, and forever. When Sir Henry Marchmont walked up the aisle of that courtroom with his robes billowing, and a battered sea chest carried behind him by a sunburnt young man, the sound the gallery made was the sound of 200 people changing their bets at once. Grimsby was on his feet before Marchmont reached the bar. "My lord, I must object. The respondent's counsel appears without notice on the very morning." "The respondent's previous counsel," said Marchmont pleasantly, "lies paralyzed in Camden Town, my lord, after which misfortune 11 separate chambers declined her brief within 4 days, a coincidence of caseloads which I am sure my learned friend finds as remarkable as I do. I appeared in this matter at 6 o'clock this morning. I am briefed, I am ready, and I have." He drew out his watch, an enormous gold turnip, and studied it, the whole of the day. "Proceed, Sir Henry," said the judge, who had bet on Marchmont himself once or twice. "I am obliged, my lord. My learned friend proposes this morning to put her grace before a panel of physicians to settle the question of incapacity in this marriage." Marchmont let the word hang. "I rise to save the court the expense. The respondent concedes that there is an incapacity in the marriage of Ravenscroft. She has always conceded it." Our whole case, my lord, is that the petitioner has brought his suit against the wrong party, and unlike my learned friend, I do not ask the court to take a lady's word for it. I ask the court to take the word of two dead gentlemen who, between them, foresaw this precise morning in this precise court, and made their depositions accordingly. He turned, slow as a gun turret, toward the Duke. One of them, my lord, was the petitioner's own father. You could have heard a pin drop into velvet. What followed filled the newspapers for a month, but I shall give it to you, dear listener, as the gallery lived it, blow by blow. First came the journals, 41 calf-bound volumes, entered through the sworn testimony of Dr. James Hale, who stood in the box with his father's steadiness and answered Grimsby's every sneer about a dead man's diaries, without once raising his voice. Provenance, custody, the sea chest, the will brick by brick. Marchmont built the wall, and on top of it he laid volume 19, open to the summer of 1824. Grimsby fought like a cat in a sack. Hearsay, inadmissible, unverifiable. And Marchmont, who had been waiting all morning for exactly that word, straightened his robes and said, "Unverifiable. My lord, I am grateful to my learned friend. The Journal of Dr. Nathaniel Hale records that in the spring of 1835, at the request of the 8th Duke of Ravenscroft, a fair copy of his medical conclusions of 1826, notarized, witnessed, and signed by both gentlemen, was lodged under joint seal with the Royal College of Physicians, deposit number 1147, to be opened upon lawful petition. My lord, I so petition. The registrar of the college is waiting in the corridor. He has brought the box." The judge looked at Grimsby. Grimsby, for the first time in his professional life, said nothing at all. And Edmund, watch Edmund now, dear listener, Edmund had gone the color of candle wax, because Edmund alone in that courtroom already knew what was in the box. He had read it once before by firelight, the night he burned it. He had burned the letter. He had never thought to ask whether careful men write letters once. The registrar was sworn. The seals, 2 seals, a physician's and a duke's, unbroken these 11 years, were examined by the court, photographed by no one, for there were no photographs then but sketched frantically by 3 newspaper artists. And then, in a silence like deep water, the box was opened, and the clerk of the court read old Dr. Hale's report aloud, in a high clear voice, to the assembled cream of England. I shall not give you the Latin, the English was enough. That his Grace's son, the said Edmund, in consequence of the febrile illness of 1824, is and will remain incapable of fathering issue, that this conclusion is certain, that it has been confirmed independently by Doctors Sinclair and Moray of Edinburgh, and that it is set down here, signed and witnessed, at the joint instruction of the 8th Duke of Ravenscroft and of the undersigned, against the day, which God forbid, that it should be needed. The courtroom did not erupt. That is the strange thing, the thing the newspapers all remarked on. It went quiet, a vast, rustling, dawning quiet, 200 minds all performing the same arithmetic at once, and every single one of them arriving in the same instant at the same sum. If the Duke could father no child. 200 pairs of eyes swung to the front row of the gallery, to the violet silk, to the pearls, to the hand that flew too late to cover the gentle curve that all of London had been toasting for a month. Lavinia Crane had turned the color of her own pearls. "My lord," said Marchmont into that terrible quiet, "I am nearly done." But the 8th Duke, being a thorough man, left one further instrument. Dr. Hale's journal records it, a sealed paper, lodged with the family's bankers at Coutts, annexed to his testamentary papers, to be produced only upon a specified occasion. He paused. "My lord, I have this morning served the bank." The specified occasion, and I ask the court to mark the old gentleman's exact words, was this: should my son Edmund, knowing his condition, ever publicly charge a wife of his with barrenness? Marchmont laid the words down one at a time, like cards. The occasion, my lord, occurred at a dinner party on the 4th of January before 40 witnesses. The bank's officer is in the corridor. He, too, has brought a box. And so, dear listener, at 20 minutes past 3 o'clock, 11 years after his death, the 8th Duke of Ravenscroft addressed his son for the last time, through the dry voice of a clerk, in a packed courtroom with the son sitting 12 feet away, gripping the table as if the floor were tilting. To my son Edmund, I leave what the law compels and my conscience permits. But I know you, Edmund, as I have written elsewhere, and so I make this provision. If you accept your condition like a man, no eye but the banker's need ever see this paper, and you may burn it unread at my funeral with my blessing. But if there should come a day when you stand before the world and lay your own defect upon an innocent woman, if you brand a blameless wife barren to save your vanity, then, from the hour that slander leaves your lips, my personal fortune, my funds, and every acre of mine not bound by law to the title, I give and devise, entire, to that wronged wife and her heirs. She will have earned it, Edmund, and you will have proved that Ravenscroft was built by better men than you. Sign here, my boy, said your grandfather to me once, and be worthy of it. I sign. Let us see what you do. The clerk stopped reading. An asterisk, now the courtroom erupted. What happened in the next 4 minutes has been told so many ways, dear listener, that I shall give you only what 300 witnesses agreed on. That Dr. Vane and his 6 crows were seen leaving by the side door before the judge had gavelled twice. That the Duke of Ravenscroft rose, said, my lord, and sat back down, because there was no end to that sentence anywhere in the world. That Lavinia Crane stood up in the gallery, swayed, groped for a supporting arm, and reached, before all of London, not toward the husband-to-be 12 feet below her, but toward the petitioner's table, toward the lawyer, who was no longer there. Josiah Grimsby had gathered his papers at the words asterisk bank's officer, quietly, precisely, aligning the edges as he always did, and had walked, not run, walked, out of the courtroom of Ravenscroft v. Ravenscroft, down the Marble Hall, past the Coutsman and the registrar, out into Chancery Lane and into the fog. It was later established that a plain, dark carriage with no arms on the door had been waiting there since noon. Mr. Grimsby, dear listener, had spent his whole life knowing to the minute when a case was lost. Lavinia Crane fainted into the arms of the bishop's wife, which everyone agreed was the finest thing she had done all season. And Charlotte sat quite still at the respondent's table in her gray cloak in the middle of the storm, and looked down at her own folded hands, those famous, steady hands, while 200 people who had crossed the street to avoid her shouted her vindication at each other over the benches. Beside her, very quietly, under the roar, young Dr. Hale leaned in and said the only words she clearly remembered afterward from the greatest afternoon in the history of London gossip. My father sends his regards, your grace. And Charlotte, Duchess of Ravenscroft, vindicated, avenged, and from the hour the slander had left her husband's lips, one of the wealthiest women in England put her steady hands over her face at last, and wept. The court adjourned. The petition, as you may imagine, did not survive the week. But there remained, dear listener, one small piece of business, a private one between a husband and a wife. It required no judge, no counsel, and no gallery. Only a breakfast table and a plate. Society, dear listener, turned its coat in a single night, because that is what society is asterisk for. The same 40 drawing rooms that had dined out all winter on the madness of the Duchess now dined, with equal appetite, on the disgrace of the Duke. Lady Ashworth, who had looked through Charlotte like a window pane at the milliner's, wrote her a 4-page letter of devotion, recalling their unbroken friendship of many years. The bishop's wife called at the Dower House twice. The newspapers, having spent February on Ravenscroft's mad Duchess, spent March on the Barren Duke, which they printed, "Dear Listener," in noticeably larger type. Charlotte answered none of the letters and received none of the callers. She had learned, in the coldest classroom in England, exactly what such friendship weighed. The reckoning itself went forward with a speed that surprised everyone but Sir Henry Marchmont. There was no defense to make, and for once in his life Edmund could not even buy delay, because the money to buy it with had ceased from the hour of the codicil's reading to be his. The old Duke's paper held like iron. His private fortune, his funds, his farms, the London house, the hunting box, the 2 manors in the Vale, everything the law did not chain to the title itself passed entire to the wronged wife and her heirs. The dowry trust, her father's £90,000, which had rebuilt Ravenscroft's roofs and paid Ravenscroft's debts and bought Grimsby's beautiful shirts. The court unwound with visible relish, citing fraud in the marriage itself. When the clerks had finished their arithmetic, Edmund, 9th Duke of Ravenscroft, retained his name, an entailed house he could no longer heat, and lands whose every rent for 11 years forward was pledged against his debts of honor. The 10th richest man in the county had become, between a Monday and a Friday, a beggar with a coronet. As for the other 2, the fog of Chancery Lane, it turned out, stretched all the way to the Channel. A warrant was sworn against Josiah Grimsby within the week. Conspiracy, subornation of witnesses, and the small matter of 40 years of Dr. Hale's records, purchased through a gentleman named Pole who had never existed. The warrant was 3 days too slow. A person answering Grimsby's description had crossed to Calais on the Tuesday night boat, traveling as a solicitor's clerk, with 2 trunks and a lady. The lady wore violet. Yes, dear listener, Lavinia Crane, who had wagered everything on becoming a duchess, sailed for France as the unwed companion of a ruined, fugitive lawyer nearly 30 years her senior. Some said afterward it had been Grimsby's scheme from the first, his child, his puppet duke, his forged path to a dukedom's fortune, with Lavinia as the beautiful instrument. Others said the scheme was hers, and the lawyer merely the sharpest tool she could find. Charlotte, who had seen that hand pressed to that cheek in the boathouse moonlight, thought privately that it hardly mattered which serpent had hatched the egg. They deserved each other, and now, penniless, nameless, and bound together by the only witness each could never silence, they had asterisked each other. There are punishments, dear listener, that no court can improve upon. Charlotte spent that spring quietly, at Ashcombe, the smaller of her 2 new manors, a warm, low, honey-stoned house that the old Duke had loved and Edmund had never once visited, which she considered its finest feature. She was not idle. Her hands had ledgers again, her own, at last, and her first entries told you everything about the woman that 8 years of Ravenscroft never could. Item, to Mr. Beauchamp of Camden Town, solicitor, a pension of £200 per annum for life, delivered with a letter that made the old man weep down his living cheek. You were the only one, sir, when being the only one was the whole of the battle. Item, to Mrs. Pettigrew, the housekeeping of Ashcombe at double wages, an offer conveyed on a Tuesday and accepted before it was finished being spoken. The great house, Mrs. Pettigrew observed, packing her box, could learn to run itself. She should like to see it try. Item, passage and a position for one Tom, a gamekeeper's boy with a talent for pheasants, far from the reach of any word from any great house, and his sister with him, the girl with the gray thread, who cried harder at being forgiven than she ever had at being caught. And one Thursday in May, when the hawthorn was out along the Ashcombe lanes, a hired gig came up the drive, and out of it stepped the Duke of Ravenscroft. Charlotte watched him come from the morning-room window and hardly knew him. It was not the plain coat, though the tailors of London had evidently closed their books to him at last. It was the walk. Edmund had walked all his life like a man arriving at his own party. The man on her gravel walked like a question. She received him, Some of you, dear listener, will say she should have had the door shut in his face, and I will not argue with you. But Charlotte had her reasons, and she had, besides, one piece of business left, and she had been waiting for him to bring himself to her because it was important for the business to be done properly that he come as what he now was, a petitioner. She received him, mark this, in the breakfast room. The table was laid. Silver, porcelain, the good bread, the May light on white linen. She sat him at the place laid ready at her right hand, and poured his coffee herself. And Edmund, golden Edmund, sat in that warm, bright room like a man who has wandered into a church of a religion not his own, turning his hat brim through his fingers. He had rehearsed, she could tell. It came out anyway in pieces. He had been mad, he had been deceived. Grimsby had managed everything, Lavinia had bewitched him. He saw it all now, and the house was so empty, Charlotte, you cannot conceive how empty, and they had rubbed along well enough once, hadn't they, in the early days? And the law allowed, that is, Marchmont's papers, the separation. None of it was final yet, nothing was signed, and if she could find it in her too, they might yet, people would say what they said, but people always. Edmund, said Charlotte gently, and he stopped. She had thought once that she would want to say a great many things at this moment. She had composed whole speeches in the cold Dower House nights, orations that scorched. But sitting in her own breakfast room in the May light, she found she needed almost none of them. That is the strange mercy of winning, dear listener. Only the losing have long speeches. She rose, went to her writing desk, and took out a packet of documents, heavy paper, beautifully engrossed, sealed and witnessed, lacking one signature only. Marchmont's clerks did lovely work. She came back to the table, and Charlotte, Duchess of Ravenscroft, placed the papers, quietly and precisely, upon her husband's plate, between the silver fork and the untouched bread. Edmund stared down at them, and then up at her, and in his face she watched him find it, the memory, the mirror, the long table and the 40 guests and the yellowed envelope beside his wine glass, watched him understand at last and completely exactly what this breakfast was. "You once did me the kindness of teaching me to read, your grace," said Charlotte. 8 years in your house I read everything, ledgers, faces, silences. She nodded once at the plate. "It's a skill like any other. By now I know how every letter ends, even before I open it." The room was very quiet. Somewhere outside, a blackbird went on about the spring. "You will find the terms more generous than the court required," she went on, in the level voice she had once used on broken ledgers. "An annuity, enough to live as a gentleman if you live as a careful one. Mrs. Pettigrew tells me careful living can be learned at any age. I did not believe her either." She drew on her gloves. "Sign where the clerk has marked, Edmund. The pen is beside your cup. It is a very good pen. It does not blot, and it does not tremble, and it will be the most honest thing you have touched in years." And Edmund, 9th Duke of Ravenscroft, who had stood up before 40 guests with a knife and a wineglass and ended a marriage in triumph, sat down alone at a breakfast table before an audience of one, and ended it again with a pen in silence. He signed. He rose. At the door he turned, and for a moment something struggled in his face, the ghost, perhaps, of the better man his father had waited for until the end. "The letter," he said hoarsely, "that first night, you never asked me what was in it, not once in all of this. Why?" Charlotte looked at him across the bright room and gave him, at the last, the smallest and most terrible of gifts, the truth. "Because your mother told me, Edmund, 8 years ago." She folded her hands. "I hoped, longer than anyone in England, that you would never make me use it." The gig rolled away down the Ashcombe lanes and out of this story. Society never received the Duke of Ravenscroft again. He lived on at the great cold house, it was said, among the covered furniture, and was seen in later years mostly at a distance, riding the empty park alone. London, as the title of our tale promised you, never forgot that dinner. But at Ashcombe, dear listener, the windows were open, and the hawthorn was out, and a certain sea chest of calf-bound journals still stood in the library, because its owner, a young surgeon lately of Calcutta, had somehow never quite finished the business of collecting it. We shall see to him next. Now, dear listener, I must tell you about the sea chest, because the sea chest, as Mrs. Pettigrew observed to the cook that summer, was carrying on a courtship all by itself. It stood in the Ashcombe Library, 41 calf-bound volumes of the late Dr. Hale, and its owner could not seem to take it home. In June he came to collect it, and stayed to dinner instead, because Charlotte had questions about Volume 9. In July he came again, with a cart, and left without the chest but with a promise to return for it, because Volume 22 contained his father's notes on the cholera year, and one could not simply wheel such a thing over rough roads. In August he came for it twice. "That chest," said Mrs. Pettigrew, watching the young surgeon walk the lanes with her mistress, the two of them talking with their hands the way clever people do, "will still be in that library when I am in my grave, and I call it a very sensible chest." Understand, it was not swift and it was not simple. How could it be? Charlotte was 1 year out of the wreck of everything. Trust, for her, was a bridge that had been burned while she stood on it, and she was in no hurry to walk out on another. And James Hale, to his everlasting credit, understood this without being told. He, who had come home across 10,000 miles to find his father dead, and his father's life's work sold to grave robbers, knew something himself about the careful rebuilding of a world. So he did not court her with flowers and speeches. He courted her, though neither of them would have used the word for the longest time, with asterisk questions. What did she think of the drainage scheme for the lower farms? Had she read the new pamphlet on the factory acts? Would she look over the accounts of the charity dispensary he was founding in the county town, really look, with that terrifying pencil of hers, because the trustees were honest men but not one of them could add? He asked her opinion, dear listener, and then here was the miracle, here was the whole revolution. He listened to the answer. 8 years Charlotte had lived with a man for whom she was furniture. Now here was one who drove 9 miles in the rain because she had found an error in the dispensary ledger, and he wanted to watch how she found it. Who fell silent when she spoke, not out of politeness, but because he was thinking about what she said. Who told her about India, the true parts, slowly, the fever camps and the frontier, the lines in his face. Because, he said simply, she of all people would not require it prettied up. They took tea on Thursdays. Charlotte never told him why Thursdays mattered. She suspected the old Duchess knew anyway and approved. It was Mrs. Pettigrew who finally lost patience in the spring of the following year, when the hawthorn was out again along the lanes. "Madam," she said, laying the tea things down with the firmness of 30 years' service, "the doctor has come 11 times since Christmas about that chest. Yesterday he looked at it, madam, the way a man looks at his own gallows. If you do not put the poor soul out of his misery, I shall give him the chest myself, and then he will have no excuse at all, and then we shall see." "Mrs. Pettigrew," said Charlotte, with 8 generations of composure, "I cannot imagine what you mean." "No, madam," said Mrs. Pettigrew. "Of course not, madam. Shall I lay 2 for dinner Thursday, madam?" "Yes," said Charlotte to her teacup. "Thank you, Pettigrew." He asked her in the library where else. On a Thursday evening in May, and he did it, dear listener, like the honest man he was, badly. He had, it transpired, prepared remarks. The remarks deserted him somewhere around the second sentence, and what was left was a sunburnt surgeon of 1 and 30 turning his father's ring around and around in his fingers and saying, finally, hopelessly, "Charlotte, I find I cannot keep coming here about the chest." "No," she agreed gravely, "it has become transparent." The trouble is that everything I might say to you has been said to you before, by a man who did not mean one word of it in front of 40 witnesses. Every promise is second-hand. You have heard asterisk cherish asterisk. You have heard asterisk honor. You signed for them once and I watched what the signature cost you. He looked up, gray-eyed, steady, his father's son. So I will not promise you feelings, madam. Feelings were promised you before lavishly. I will promise you conduct. My father's one instruction was asterisk stand by her, and I have discovered in 2 years of trying that there is nowhere else I can bear to stand. If you will have me, I will spend my life proving one thing only, that when this man tells you something at a table in front of witnesses or in an empty room, it will be true. That is the whole of my speech. It was better rehearsed. There was originally a part in Latin. And Charlotte, who had once crossed a dining room of 40 guests with her whole world burning and her hands perfectly steady, found that her hands were not steady at all now, and that this, at last, was the correct occasion for it. The Latin can wait, she said. Yes. They were married in September in the small stone church in the village, and I wish you could have seen it, dear listener, because London saw nothing of it, which was precisely the point. No 40 guests. No bishops. Charlotte wore blue, not gray. She never wore gray again in all her life and was given away by no man, walking up the short aisle alone by her own choice, mistress of her own hand at last, to where her surgeon waited with his heart in his face. In the pews, Mrs. Pettigrew, weeping magnificently into a lace handkerchief the size of a tablecloth. Sir Henry Marchmont, K.C., who had refused all payment for the greatest case of his career and now claimed his fee, he said, in cake. A gamekeeper's boy named Tom, scrubbed to shining beside his sister. And in a wheeled chair by the front pew, brought 90 miles at Charlotte's arrangement, old Mr. Beecham, half his face still sleeping, the living half wet with tears, who, when Charlotte paused on her way up the aisle and bent to kiss his cheek, managed with great labor the only wedding toast that mattered, 5 words, dragged glorious out of the ruined side of his mouth. Enough, after all, your grace. She kept the name Hale, dear listener. She had had a duchess's name, and knew to the penny what it was worth. Mrs. James Hale she signed herself in ledgers and letters with that firm clear hand, for the rest of her days, though the county, to the end, could never quite give up calling her Grace asterisk, and she gave up correcting them, because some habits, like some titles, are conferred by love and cannot be annulled. And then, the following summer, the thing happened that you, dear listener, have been waiting for since the first minute of this tale. The thing that made 3 physicians in a row clear their throats and check their notes twice. The thing that Mrs. Pettigrew, who guessed it first, as she guessed everything first, celebrated by sitting down abruptly on the kitchen stairs and laughing and crying into her apron at the same time for a quarter of an hour by the kitchen clock. Charlotte was expecting a child. The woman branded Barren before all of London. The wife examined by rumor, condemned by hired physicians, priced at £300 and a cold cottage. There had never, the reader will have grasped this long ago, been anything in the world the matter with Charlotte. The defect had slept elsewhere all along, in Golden Edmund, and 8 wasted years had been his and his alone. But knowing a thing, dear listener, and holding it small and furious and alive with Dr. Hale's gray eyes, are 2 very different kinds of truth. They named her Margaret for the old Duchess. Of course they did. And on a morning that October, the Times of London carried among its announcements 4 lines of small print, at Ashcombe on the 9th inst, to Dr. James Hale and his wife Charlotte, formerly Duchess of Ravenscroft, a daughter. The compositor who set those lines had no idea what he was setting. All London did. It was read aloud at 40 breakfast tables that morning, dear listener, over the toast and the marmalade, with what I can only call reverence, and at 39 of them someone was heard to say some version of the same sentence. Well, there is the verdict then, delivered a little late but delivered. And the 40th table. The 40th table stood in the great cold breakfast room of Ravenscroft House, where the covers were on half the furniture and the one footman left had let the fire go small. There the 9th Duke, alone at the head of a table laid for one, unfolded his paper as he did every morning, one of the last luxuries he had not surrendered, and found the announcement, as he was always going to find it, at the bottom of the page. He sat for a long time, they say, the paper open, the coffee going cold, the clock ticking in the hall. What he thought, no one knows. There was no one left in that house who cared to wonder. But the footman, clearing later, noticed 2 things and mentioned them in the village, and so they come down to us. The paper had been folded back, carefully, to the announcements. And the plate, dear listener, the plate had never been touched at all. 12 years, dear listener, let them turn like pages. It is a July afternoon at Ashcombe, and the garden is at the loud, gold, overgrown stage of summer that no head gardener can forbid and no sensible one tries to. Under the big beech there is a tea table. On the lawn there is a wicket badly defended. And the sound of the place, you would know it blindfold, is the particular sound of a house where nothing is wrong. Bees, an argument about the rules of cricket, a spaniel with opinions, and somewhere upstairs a piano being practiced at mostly. At the tea table sits a woman in blue with silver coming into her dark hair, going through a stack of correspondence with a pencil, because some habits are constitutional, while her husband, grayer too now, and the most consulted physician in 3 counties, pretends to read a medical journal and actually watches, over the top of it, his wife and his children and his one green miraculous acre of the world, with the quiet astonishment of a man who has never once gotten used to it. 3 children, Margaret 12, all elbows and questions with her grandfather's gray eyes, Nathaniel 9, named for a man he never met, currently disputing a leg before wicket with the spaniel, and small Anne 6, asleep in the shade with jam on her chin, named for an old duchess whose portrait rescued, at Charlotte's particular instruction, from a covered corridor of a cold house, hangs at the turn of the Ashcombe stairs, where she can keep an eye on things. Mrs. Pettigrew, 71 and refusing all discussion of the subject, still commands the household. She has buried 1 Queen's Jubilee and 2 junior housemaids' engagements, and intends, she says, to train Miss Margaret's housekeeper personally before she considers any nonsense about rest. It was Margaret, of course, who asked. It was always going to be Margaret. She had heard something in the village. Children always hear something in the village. A fragment of the old story, the great story, the one the county still told at Christmas. The dinner, the 40 guests, the lady in gray. And she came across the lawn that afternoon with her fists full of purpose, planted herself in front of the tea table, and demanded, in the way of 12-year-olds, the truth of the world entire. Mama, Mrs. Hobbs at the post office says that before you were our mama you were a duchess, and that a wicked duke stood up at a dinner in front of everybody and told a dreadful lie about you, and that you didn't cry at all and you didn't shout at all, you only gave him a letter and curtsied, and it ruined him. She paused for breath. Waller says it isn't true. Waller says ladies don't ruin dukes. Waller, said Charlotte, is behind on his history. Then it's true, Margaret's eyes were enormous. But Mama, what was in the letter? The garden went on humming. James Hale lowered his journal 1 inch, and over the top of it, across 12 years of Thursdays, his eyes met his wife's. And Charlotte set down her pencil and looked at her daughter, this fierce, safe, freckled girl who would never in her life have to learn arithmetic in the cold, and found that the true answer was very simple and had been waiting all these years, folded up small, for exactly this moment. The truth was in it, my darling, she said, written down by 2 careful old men, long before anyone needed it and kept safe until the day someone did. She tucked a strand of hair behind her daughter's ear. That is the whole secret, Margaret, so attend to it. Some letters are not written to be read at once. Some letters are written early * and sealed, and carried quietly through the cold for years, if they must be, until the one right moment. And the art of it, the whole art, my love, is not the writing, she smiled. It is knowing how to wait. Margaret considered this with 12-year-old gravity. And you knew how. I was taught, said Charlotte, by the lady on the stairs. Far off to the north that same afternoon, for we must glance there once, dear listener, a last time, the way one glances at a milestone going by. The gates of Ravenscroft House stood shut, as they had stood shut for years. The 9th Duke lived on behind them still, grey now before his time, among the covered furniture and the debts. The village saw him only at a distance, a horseman alone on the empty park in the early mornings, always at a distance, growing smaller every year. The title, everyone knew, would pass at his death to his cousin's line, a plain living naval family, said to be honest exactly, dear listener, as a careful old man had arranged it in writing long ago. Ravenscroft would be built again by better men. Its founder had seen to that too. And London. London never forgot. Though the players scattered and the century wore on, the story outlived them all, polished by 10,000 tellings into the small, perfect, terrible shape it holds to this day. The shape you were promised, dear listener, at the very beginning. That once, before all of London, a duke stood up at his own table and declared his wife Barren. That his wife did not weep and did not shout. That she rose and walked the length of that glittering table and quietly placed a letter on his plate. That she curtsied, and that the curtsy lasted longer than the duke. At Ashcombe the cricket resumed. The spaniel won. Charlotte Hale poured the tea in the gold light in the loud garden in the middle of the life that no one at that dinner could ever have imagined for her. And, dear listener, if you should ever doubt that patience is a form of power, or that a quiet woman is ever to be underestimated, remember her as we leave her now, steady-handed, silver-haired, and entirely, unanswerably happy. Some letters take years to arrive. The best ones, dear listener, are worth the wait. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.